"Dad, why are you here?" I blurted out in shock, barely able to believe my eyes. There he was, under the scorching sun, lying inside an old, battered tent that looked straight out of my childhood memories. "Ah, don't mind me, it's just the usual," he replied weakly, his voice startlingly frail. For a moment, I was speechless. Since his leg injury, Dad had been staying with my brother, Peter, and his wife, Nova. Every time I checked in, Peter assured me that Dad was doing well, and Nova would chime in with a cheerful laugh, saying she was taking good care of him. They always had an excuse for why I couldn't speak to Dad directly, saying he wasn't tech-savvy and had made new friends at the hospital, enjoying a fresh, fulfilling life. But seeing him there, lying listlessly under the blazing sun, I knew that everything they'd told me was a lie. Dad weakly gestured in a direction, and I followed his gaze, my heart heavy. Although I'd always lived in the city near my parents, I had moved to a rural area to pursue my dream of working at a resort hotel. After the car accident that took my mom's life 2 years ago, Dad had struggled with not only his injury but also with a deep depression. They had been inseparable, known as the loving couple of our neighborhood. Though Dad was naturally a homebody, he'd often traveled with Mom to make her happy, despite his preferences. It was on one of these trips that the accident occurred, leaving him alone. "Why did I survive instead of her?" he'd whisper in his grief, an unbearable weight that seemed to grow by the day. My brother Peter, who lived nearby, offered his support, reassuring me often. "Don't worry, Margot, we're here to help. Focus on your job," he'd say, and I was grateful. Peter had even mentioned his own struggles, particularly with finances. "We've been tightening our belts over here, barely making it through each month," he'd confessed, "but Nova and I thought about moving in with Dad. It'd save money, and we could take care of him at the same time." I was relieved to hear it, thankful that he and Nova were willing to care for Dad. Since then, I'd called regularly to check in, and Peter assured me that everything was fine. He even said Dad had started smiling again. Each call eased my worries a bit more, so I focused on my work, feeling that Dad was in good hands. But when I finally returned home after several years, the sight that greeted me was disturbing. The old house was stiflingly hot, and in the front yard, an unfamiliar, dilapidated tent stood out like a sore thumb. I approached it, sensing someone inside, and felt my heart sink. "I'm back," I called as I entered the house, shaken. "Margot, you look pale, what's wrong?" Nova asked, surprised. "There's someone in the tent outside," I stammered, bracing myself for her response. "Oh, that's just Dad," she replied casually, as though it were perfectly normal. "Wait, Dad's out there? In this heat?" I gasped. I rushed to the tent, finding Dad lying there as if he had collapsed. "Nova, I'm calling an ambulance," I said, panicked by his condition. "No need," she replied sharply. "It's his wish to stay in the yard," she added dismissively, saying something that made no sense. That didn't sound like Dad. He'd always been the type to avoid the heat, much preferring the comfort of air-conditioned rooms in summer. I had never once seen him volunteer to be outdoors, not even when Mom was alive. Something felt deeply wrong, and a sinking feeling crept over me as I looked at him, sprawled and vulnerable in the tent. Dad's lawyer took over the call, his tone calm yet resolute. "Peter, I represent your father. The house belongs to him, and he has decided to take legal action regarding the misuse of his property and the mistreatment he endured." Peter sputtered in disbelief. "But, we were just..." Dad said. The lawyer interrupted sharply. "Your father has been hospitalized due to your neglect. Any further attempts to claim ownership of the house will be considered trespassing. He is making arrangements to live elsewhere, and you and your wife have no legal grounds to remain." Peter's anger flared. "You can't do this." The lawyer remained unfazed. "This is your formal notice. You have until the end of the week to vacate the premises." In the background, I could hear Nova wailing, desperately protesting that they had nowhere else to go. A sense of poetic justice washed over me. Their greed had finally caught up with them. Over the next few months, Dad and I focused on rebuilding our lives together. The house, filled with memories of my mother, had been a burden more than a comfort. What truly mattered was restoring Dad's peace and dignity. We soon found a new home, one filled with warmth, kindness, and the respect he so richly deserved. Grandpa took the phone, his voice stern and steady as he addressed Peter. "Peter, I've heard everything from Margot. What you did to your father is unacceptable." Peter was stunned into silence. Our family home, originally built by Grandpa as a wedding gift to my mom, held deep sentimental value for him. Grandpa had always treated my dad, who was adopted into the family, as his own son. When I told Grandpa what had happened, his fury was palpable. Without hesitation, he sent some of his strongest apprentices to help clear out my brother and his wife. As Grandpa explained the situation to Peter, he was met with nervous resistance. "You can't just decide things on your own," Peter stammered, though his tone was laced with fear. Grandpa retorted, "A person who treats family with such disrespect has no right to protest. Now, pack your things and leave." Defeated, Peter couldn't muster a reply. He'd never dared defy Grandpa, whose authority was both firm and fair. Soon after, Grandpa had Peter and Nova's belongings moved to Nova's parents' house, where her father was already waiting for them, arms crossed and visibly displeased. "You two will live under my roof now," Nova's father declared firmly. When Peter tried to argue, "We'll just go back to the family home," Nova's father cut him off. "After what you did to your father, you need a serious attitude adjustment. Don't even think about going back." Unable to object further, Peter and Nova were left with no choice but to comply. Living with Nova's father came with strict rules. Nova was responsible for cooking daily meals from scratch, while Peter had to work weekends alongside her father. Over time, they adapted to this disciplined environment, even beginning to appreciate the structure. Meanwhile, Dad focused on his recovery and worked on repairs around the family home, pouring himself into the memories of Mom that filled each corner. "Working on this house brings back so many memories," he said to me one day, a spark of joy in his eyes. "It's like I can feel her presence here." With the repairs complete, Dad surprised us with a decision. "I think Mom would want me to move on," he said, a gentle smile on his face. "Now that the house is beautiful again, I'd like for someone else to make new memories here." Before long, we found a buyer, and Dad and Grandpa decided to move together to a peaceful senior community where they could spend their days in comfort and company. As for Peter and Nova, they seemed content at first with the new routines at Nova's parents' home, free from caregiving responsibilities, but their lack of remorse quickly became apparent. Finally, fed up with their ungrateful attitudes, Nova's father told them to leave. "You show no sign of regret or gratitude," he said firmly. "It's time for you to go." Dad, meanwhile, found solace in his new home, surrounded by friends and visited frequently by me. Our family had weathered the storm and come out stronger, having rediscovered the true meaning of connection and support. Peter and Nova, left to fend for themselves, were forced to reflect on the family bonds they had once taken for granted.